check-ins. Here we go. Alrighty, and just so that all of us are on the same page, and for those who are joining us afterwards, the book club is really intended to follow sort of a conversational style. We're going to start off with a little bit of time to spend with Paul about his journey. We'll then talk about the book specifically, and then we're going to open it up to all of you if you want to ask any questions or give any comments or feedback to Paul. We are going to ask you for the first little bit to stay on mute. Feel free to give us your videos if you want so that we can see you, but you're not expected to. And then we'll let you know when it's time to unmute and join the conversation as well. That'll be in about 45 minutes to an hour or so. If you do have a question, we will be looking at the chat, and periodically we may make some comments, or if there's other information that we need to put in the chat, we will add that into the chat. And for those of you who are lawyers in Ontario and are looking for CPD hours, just a reminder, this does give you 90 minutes of CPD, so 1.5 hours of professionalism credit for you. And as always, this is an accountable space. We want to have a dialogue, we want to have a conversation, but we also want it to be respectful, and we want it to be, we want to be able to learn and grow and share. So I'm hoping that everybody will respect the accountability guidelines that I had sent around earlier. So with all of that out of the way, welcome back to Ivana as well. She's joining us again, and we're going to get started. I am so excited. I have observed Paul from a distance and from close as he has progressed through his career journey in the last few years. And Paul, I am so excited to hear you talk about the book with others now. You and I have talked about it from sort of idea and conception stage to the development of it, and now you're going to be sharing with others in this part of the soft launch period of time for you, a little bit about your book, The Happy Lawyer. And some people may think it's an oxymoron, and I really want us to have that conversation to see what it's all about. What we're going to start with, though, Paul, I'm going to invite you to share a little bit about your career journey. People really like hearing how others got to where they are, what they did along the way, what motivated them along the way, sort of the personal highlights, if you will, whether it's career and or other elements that impacted your journey so far. And so private practice, in-house, coach, now an author, husband, son, father, all of those really wonderful things. And I just wanted to turn it over to you. If you could share with us your highlights before we dig into the book.
For sure. I'm very happy to. First of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I was called in 2010, and I started on Bay Street at Stikeman's, and I was there for almost 3 years. I was doing corporate work, securities and M&A, private and public. And then I went to the Bay, and I once again did corporate, and actually I got to work on some pretty neat things. Like I was the lead legal on bringing the Pusateri stores into the Saks Fifth Avenue stores. So that was pretty fun and satisfying. And those negotiation meetings just had the best food catered.
Little perk there, right?
Yeah, huge perk. My business person would always say, like, do you want to do the meetings here or at their place? Their place, always their place. Yeah. And then I went to Metrolinx, and I was at Metrolinx for about 6 years, including my 2 parental leaves when I was off with my kids. And once again, did corporate work for them, a lot of partnerships, and helped to bring the Presto cards into Shoppers Drug Mart. So a number of interesting things. I've sort of had a pretty lucky career from a legal perspective. And my legal career ended as of last summer, 2022. So that was when I stopped being a lawyer and focused instead on all of this other stuff that I've been working on for about 5, almost 6 years now. So that's, I guess, so that's the legal part of my career. Mm-hmm. On the other side, so about 6 years ago, just under 6 years ago, I started learning how to coach. And just over 5 years ago, I hung up my shingle and started a business as a life coach, and spent, quite a few years sort of working through that, figuring out what it's like. And about 2.5 years ago, I decided, I was I was not a very happy lawyer, but there were happy lawyers out there. It made me think, what are they doing that I wasn't doing? What were they thinking that I wasn't thinking? And vice versa. Maybe I can reverse engineer why
Mhm.
some of them were happier and others weren't. And so that's what started the Happy Lawyer Project, which eventually culminated in the book that we're here in part to talk about today.
Fantastic. And um, along the way, it's interesting because you talk about moving from practice in-house, life coach, now an author. Um, Oftentimes, especially from a career counselor's perspective, we invite people to be very strategic or plan their career journey. I also know, and I posted about this, I think it was earlier this week on Monday, serendipity and chance encounters sometimes play a role. Can you share with us maybe how much of your journey that you described to date, how much of that was intentional, planned, you've got to do A, B, and C before you do X, Y, and Z, and how much of it, or what examples are there of those chance occurrences, serendipity occurring?
I would say all of both in a way. There's been plenty of chance encounters and serendipity. Like, for instance, I got my job at the Bay not because I applied for it, but because I went on secondment there.
Interesting.
And
Mm-hmm.
I only got the secondment because the relationship partner knew I had done good work. And so reached out to me to ask if I wanted to go. And then the Metrolinx thing, I also hadn't applied for that job. A recruiter had reached out about a different job while I was at the Bay. And then that recruiter's colleague reached out to me about the Metrolinx job. So there's certainly been some parts of it where I have been sort of on autopilot, just using the compass of what do I want as sort of a
Mm-hmm.
North Star. But there does come a time when it's not sufficient, wasn't for me at least, sufficient to fly by the seat of my pants, because in a way, when you build up momentum in a certain direction, the momentum is going to keep barreling you in that direction unless you're intentional about switching. And that was me. I decided I wanted to do something else, and I spent a long time thinking about it. I tried I tried writing at first because I was going to be a fiction writer. That was something I was
Ah,
considering.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know, pretty funny. And and then I tried coaching as a way to test out therapy, and then got to coaching and was like, actually, this is pretty cool. So let me stick around for a little bit.
Glad that you have stuck around. Is there I'm just curious, oftentimes the role that the authors have at this stage, you're a nonfiction writer for now. Might that be something that comes up at a later stage for you?
Oh,
Or is it too
100%.
early to tell?
100%.
Okay.
100%. I will be a fiction writer. I still do write fiction occasionally.
Hmm.
I don't know when. Like right now, this is a pretty fun rabbit hole.
Okay.
So I'm content to tumble down it for now. And at some point I will. I also think that like things do unfold as they're meant to.
Yeah.
As much as I would not necessarily have chosen to become a lawyer knowing what I know now, I also can't fault myself for it and can't regret even a moment of the journey because of all that I learned and what it made me, right? Like, I don't think this book is written if I didn't do that in the first place.
Yeah. It's interesting. You said in terms of becoming a lawyer, was that something you had planned through and thought through, or was that more serendipity? Was that one of the earlier structured thoughts that you had
Well,
decided?
I mean, I think I decided I was going to be a lawyer probably in mid high school.
Okay.
Because law, even then, law was my second choice, but I just never knew what my first choice was.
Okay.
And so they say, like, well, you got to pick undergrad, and your undergrad usually has to line up with whatever you want to do afterwards. And so I figured, well, I guess I'll aim for law, and then I'll change direction when I figure out what I really want to do.
Okay.
And instead of that taking 1 or 2 years, it took 15.
Which isn't a long time, generally speaking. Others take longer on the journey. So in the meantime, you had some good days along the way for the lawyering as well, right?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's in Tony Robbins says something. I love him or hate him. He's a real figure. He says something really fascinating, that most of us vastly overestimate what we can get done
Mhm.
in a year. and we vastly underestimate what we can get done in 10. And it is interesting to think about that. Like, you're right, it was actually the exact right amount of time for me. And now I've been a coach for 5 years, and I don't know 5 years ago if I would have predicted where I'm standing now. And I don't know that I could have predicted where I will be standing in 5 years. So,
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And
mm,
as to the author, we'll see how that forms part of it for
yeah.
you. We're going to talk about identities a little bit, but let's just go through. I always ask all of my authors the first question of their why. What was important about this book? And you've got it coming out on the shelves very soon. What was important about getting this out into the world? What was your why for this book, Paul?
I mean, I was a lawyer for a very long time, and I always wanted to be happy. And also, as a lawyer for a very long time, I went to a lot of CPDs that were pretty interesting. And I was like, oh, that was neat. And then I left and nothing changed. And I was like, man, I wish I could write a book that fixed that, that solved that, that somehow, when you see something differently, you can't necessarily unsee it. And so that's what I set out to be like, okay, let's rewind and not look at the 7 habits of highly effective people, or the 6 high performance habits, or all of these different things. And instead we rewind and we think, how does it work from a broader perspective, so that we can actually practically make these
Mhm.
changes?
Did you know that you were going to get a book, that you were going to start writing the book when you started the Happy? Because it started as a project for you, right? Was that the original intent, is to actually get it into a book, or was it to do the research, to really ask? Because you talk to quite a few people for this.
Yeah.
What was your original intention?
It really, I mean, my mentor had suggested it, my business mentor. And I think he suggested it from the perspective of like, you get out and talking to lawyers. And when he suggested it, I don't even think he was attached to the idea that I write a book, just that I tell people I was writing a book. But as soon as he said it, I thought, no, man, I'm a writer. I will write a book. Like, it wouldn't be an integrity for me to sort of chase that path without the firm intention to be writing. But it was interesting. It didn't come, it's not like a linear, like, oh, I said I'm going to write it, and then like here we are now. I did the exact numbers are escaping me, but about 14 or 15 interviews in the first year.
Oh.
That's it.
Mhm.
That's it for the whole
You
first
mean
year
interviews with
with
lawyers?
lawyers. Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay.
So just 14 or 15 interviews. And then a full year later, I'm sitting down, I'm trying to figure out what to do. And this very same mentor says, well, you got a bit of a runway. Why don't you just focus for the next month only on getting interviews? Forget
Mm.
everything else. Forget posting, forget this, forget trying to make sales, just do interviews. So that was really interesting, because then I spent the next month and a half and I went from 15 interviews to 60.
Wow.
Right. So it totally has not been linear, and the book has sort of jumped up and plateaued and jumped and plateaued, and has, I don't know, surprised me at most turns and twists along the ways.
I love that. And of the 60, I'm just curious, if you don't mind my asking, I know this is not one of the planned questions, but
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the
sure.
60 people that you spoke with, were they all people that you knew, or were there people that were sort of just coming to you because of the theme and of the topic?
So it was just in the first year that I had done 60 interviews, right? So I've now spoken with over 100,
Yeah.
interviewed as part of this, like even forgetting people I've coached and friends and family and self. So, and I would say it's a mix.
Okay.
Some of the people I reached out and said, hey, I would love to talk to you. Some of those people I knew in advance. Others I actually didn't know in advance. I just saw them post about having left law and come back 10 years later. And I thought, this is a perspective I need to have.
Mhm.
And then there were some people that just saw me on my journey and reached out to me and said, hey, let's connect,
I love it. I love
about a
it.
story. Yeah.
So let's all connect and ensure that we are speaking from the same page. The happy lawyer, let me ask you how you are defining the word happy. You say happy is the good life well lived in particular. That's how you started. How and why did you arrive at this particular definition? And am I off about how you want the definition of happy to be, just so that we're all,
No,
understanding the premise, the foundation?
you are exactly on point. That is exactly what I wanted the definition to be. The good life well lived.
Mm.
Why? That's interesting. I think I always wanted to be happy, right? So I wrote this book for me 8 years ago, or 10 years ago. Just that guy, the young lawyer who's like, man, life was meant to be more than this. What the hell am I doing? I wish that he could have had this book and leafed through it and been like, oh, okay, I see a little bit more. Let me try a few things and make a few small bets and see how they pay off or not.
Mhm.
Um, but so I always wanted to be happy. So it was clear to me that that needed to be the compass for this. But I also had another decade of experience dealing with all sorts of things like anxiety and depression. And I came to learn a lot of things about emotions, right? Like a lot of us, when we hear happy, we think emotion. It's the happiness emotion, right? But with anxiety, it was pretty interesting. I didn't like to be anxious. And so I tried to push away the anxiety, and that made it worse. Right. So I came to learn that actually trying to control your emotions is a losing game. That's not a game you want to be in. And so when it came time to try and figure out what happy was, because it was and still is my compass. So then I had to break down, well, what do I actually mean by that if it's not an emotion? And that was sort of working backwards and also working with people as I was talking with them about what was going well in their life, what was not going well. I started to sort of land on my definition, which is we're in the good life well lived, which is not universal, right? It's for you, it's your good life and lived well as you determine. For me, it's my good life lived well. So does that provide a little more color?
No, it does. It does. And it's I think it's important for people to appreciate the definition that you have given to happy in terms of the happy lawyer. And it's really interesting to hear you say that it was and continues to be your compass. You were drawn to being happy, even as a high school student, you said university student. It wasn't just something that you needed to come to as a lawyer, as a young lawyer. It was something that had been part of your compass, even if you didn't have that language for it, even before that, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is interesting to sort of unpack what that also looked like. Like, I I don't think I had the word for it in high school, but I certainly wanted it. Right. And I think what I did want was I wanted freedom. I wanted time to pursue my interests. And I think that informs some of my values, right? Like
Mhm.
what I like. I really do value freedom and autonomy. I
Mm.
really do value being in flow and being creative. And so for me, my good life well lived is probably a lot more full of things like that than it is full of the happy emotion.
Uh,
Like I love spending myself on a project like this, like going out for a run and just like destroying myself and leaving it all out on the track. Like it's
mhm.
sort of fun.
It makes you happy. It is part of your good life lived. It's part
It,
of your good life
yeah,
lived. And I
absolutely.
really appreciate your comment that there's no universal definition for it, because it depends on what each of us think of and need and value as part of our good life well lived. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important for each person here to be thinking about what that might be. So let me go on. In the second part of the book, it's about self-awareness. And we know how difficult that process of self-awareness can be. Oftentimes, those in the legal profession don't take the time, aren't given permission, don't give themselves permission to reflect and be self-aware. And a factor that you most found that happy lawyers share is those who are self-aware specifically. And you point out three elements of self-awareness. I just want to look to my notes: perception, vision, and direction. Those were three things that you said help people be more self-aware. Tell us more about what this means to you and how you found those three elements that are part of the self-awareness.
Mm-hmm. Um, so if we back up, actually, it might make sense. Can I try drawing? Can I try sharing?
You want me to share screen? Or do you want to give you
Yeah,
permission
only
to share
hosts
screen?
can share. I'd love to share screen here.
All right. Make co-host. You are it. There we go.
Okay.
We're gonna get some drawings here.
Did you do the iPad? Can you do Paul's iPad? There's
Yeah. Yep,
it's like
got
the
it.
10th or 11th person.
There we go. Paul's iPad is now co-host as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Pull up my pen here. Share content, screen, start broadcast. Okay, here we
I'm
go.
just putting in the chat perception, vision, and direction.
Okay. So we've got on the one, oh, that's not it. Self-awareness, right? So before we start getting into self-awareness, I actually think we need to understand it in the context of where it sits in the whole thing. So self-awareness is intrinsically linked with intentional action in this happy lawyer model, right? It wasn't just the one and it wasn't just the other, because there were lawyers who were extremely self-aware, in some cases excruciatingly self-aware, and they were deeply unhappy. So self-awareness wasn't enough on its own. Self-awareness existed with intentional action as part of the happy lawyer sort of process. And it did this by self-awareness informing intentional action, and then intentional action informing self-awareness. So when you understand this, then it starts to inform the different components of self-awareness, right? Because one component of self-awareness is here, intentional action, now becoming more self-awareness. So there's an element of needing to reflect, right? You need to make sense of what's come before. Then you also need to set a direction. So basically an intention for the action you are going to be taking. But a direction doesn't really, it's not that useful out of context of the destination you want to go, right? Direction really is the next step on your journey, but it doesn't tell you where you want your journey to end up. So then there's that destination side, or as I like to call it, your vision, the vision you have for it. And so there's these three elements that have just started to inform themselves about how they roll in, right? Like I've met some people and coached some people who have needed to work on their reflection, who don't necessarily see life the way it really is. And then there's other people who've been very clear on what exactly is going on in their life, but who don't have a direction. They don't really know what to do next. They sort of know, broadly speaking, that they want to be comfortable, happy in their relationships, like some fulfilling work, but not too much of it. But then they're like, well, how do I actually put that into play? Like, what do I actually do to get there? But and yet there are other people who don't even have that broader vision, or who won't. And it's a spectrum, right? Like there's the person who maybe somewhere on the middle who says, I want to have fulfilling work, I want to have strong relationships. And then on the one side is someone who has nothing. Then there's that person I talked about. And then there's someone else who can tell you with excruciating detail, hey, I want to be a partner at a big firm. I want to be doing public M&A. I want at least a few times a year my deals to be in the newspaper, right? And that's the work side. I also want to have a relationship. I want to have kids. I want them to be in private school. So some people have a super detailed view. So that is where self-awareness came from, to see, well, how does it actually fit in, and what way to break down. How would it make sense to break down what is already happening in a way that will help us to make sense of it and to leverage it? The idea being, I wanted it to be in as few components as possible, so that if you hit these components, you are good to go. But if you're missing any one of these, you're probably going to have some issues, right? If you don't know, if you don't really know what's going on, if you're missing the reflection piece, you're going to have some problems, because your vision and your direction aren't going to be grounded in reality. if you're missing the vision piece, your
Hmm.
directions are going to be totally random, like a GPS that keeps messing on you and tells you to go left and then right, and you're basically
Exactly.
in circles. And if you don't have the direction, then you're just sitting there wondering what you're actually supposed to do with the vision. So you need all three of these, I think.
Paul, I'm just wondering, with self-awareness, um, all three components, or even just a couple of them, uh, in your conversations, was there a particular reason that you could draw on as to why some lawyers would not take time to become self-aware? Or did you find that everybody had some level of self-awareness? I found that in some people that I speak with, they feel that it's not necessary to even think about that. Just keep going ahead, set your goals, just move ahead. And I wonder if that was part of your experience as well when you were doing the research for this book.
I certainly know some people like that.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember if those people came up in the interviews. Um, there's some people that just don't care about it. There were a whole
Yeah.
bunch of people that expressed an urge to be more self-aware.
Hmm.
They wanted to. I'd say that's more common. People who want to be more self-aware, but then don't actually dedicate any resources to it, right? Like time or money or whatever. Uh,
Energy, permission sometimes to do it, right? We're not given that permission sometimes with a legal professional hat on. So I
totally,
hear, sorry.
totally.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. Um, we're going to come back to vision in a little bit, but where I want to move us to right now, because this is something that I had struggled with for a long time. In chapter 5, I found it fascinating when you started discussing taking action, and you write about taking complete. The word that you use is responsibility for our life, and the reason that resonated was because for it can be tough when you are the one that's responsible. For the longest time, I would not make one change or wouldn't do something because of either my husband, my boss. I would sort of point the finger, oh no, they are, not wanting me to move ahead with that. And until I finally realized, no, it's on me, which is good and scary. But that responsibility, that ability to take action, take complete responsibility for my life is on me. And it took a while to get there. You've gotten there a lot sooner than I have, but why is this an important theme for you, that responsibility part for taking action? I see a smile there.
Yeah, it's uh it's a foundational piece for everything else, right? If you are constantly um shirking your responsibility, then you're not going to be taking the actions you actually need to be taking. There's this book, If Life is a Game, Then These Are the Rules, and it sets out 10 rules. And I think the first one says that there's no failures or mistakes, only lessons. And I think the second rule was, if it was not the second, it was the third. Lessons are repeated until they are learned.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that this lesson of taking responsibility for your life and not making it someone else's problem is one of those lessons that keeps on repeating. One of the most interesting places I see it play out, and it has in my life and in plenty of clients and friends, is in our relationships, right? Like even you said there, like I didn't give myself permission to do something because, it was someone else's decision, my husband's decision.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I blame my wife for all sorts of stuff. And then only after I spend some time getting self-aware, like sometimes journaling, often working with a coach or someone else who are just saying, who puts me in the position, like takes her out of it. And I realize like, oh, this is all my shit that I've just
Yeah.
projected onto her.
Yeah.
And so there's an element of taking complete responsibility that is so important if we actually want to be who we want to be, who we are, who we're destined to be, all of this sort of stuff, that if we don't take complete responsibility, we're dead in the water before we've even started.
It's interesting because we'll take responsibility professionally for some things, potentially, but not necessarily for some things that are part of our life, right? We'll make decisions in our work all the time, but then it's really scary to be the one that, the buck stops here in various personal matters. And so I think that just really hit home and that really resonated. So I'm grateful for you to have included that in the book and to be discussing it. Did it,
I've heard it described, just before we move on, I've heard it described as a terrible responsibility.
what do you mean?
Um, well, just how scary it is.
Ah,
That
yes.
it's that this responsibility that we can all take, it's a terrible responsibility,
Mhm.
because not only does it bring freedom with it, it also brings blame. Blame's the
Yeah,
wrong word, but responsibility being the right word.
consequences.
Yes, it
Yeah,
does. You
yeah.
realize that the buck really does stop with you, and all of a sudden, just shit gets real in a different way.
And for anyone, I'll put my hand up there as well, who had this essence of need to be, if not perfect. I've dropped the perfectionism a long time ago, but that kept me back for a long time because God, if I took responsibility and flopped, oh no, that can't work. And so that I think was part of what was holding me back. But that let's, it is scary. And whoever coined that phrase, a terrible responsibility, I think is right. But it's so necessary. And there is that freedom that comes from finally sort of taking that stand and owning your decisions and really, really allowing yourself
Mhm.
to to grow with the decisions that you make for yourself. So I'm glad to see that you had a part of that, and especially given that as part of your interviews you must have heard that come up repeatedly, right? People who were happier finally decided to take the responsibility for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a spectrum. I think we're all on our own journey towards that, right? I don't know anybody, myself included, in the middle of this work that truly does take 100% responsibility, right? I don't know anybody yet, but we are all close, like getting closer to it, ideally. There's one other interesting part of it, though, that I think is worth us briefly discussing. It won't be applicable to everyone on this call, but it'll probably be applicable to some. Is what about when you take more than 100% responsibility?
Yeah.
Right? As Gay Hendricks says, if it's anything less than 100% responsibility, then you're playing the victim card. And if it's anything more than 100% responsibility, you're playing the martyr card.
Mm-hmm.
You're pulling in other people's responsibility and making it part of your bailiwick, but that's not actually appropriate because it's not your responsibility. And so this, I think, can be distinguished from some of the, I think it's Jocko Willink or whatever, a bunch of the Marines turned authors who talk about taking responsibility for every single thing in your life, even if it's not your fault.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yet I think that there's an important distinction to be made for the things that are not in your direct control. And if you try to take responsibility for that, then that's also a losing game. You end up siphoning off way too many of your resources to handle this stuff that's not actually your responsibility.
No, I think that's a really good point. Finding that balance is really critical. If we're trying to take responsibility, because we're not pointing the finger or offering it to somebody else, then boy, we don't want to take things that really belong to somebody else away from them. Let them deal with that aspect of it. And I think finding that balance really is a work in progress. And I respect how you commented, we're all on this journey and we're all works in progress. And I think that reminder, wherever we're at is where we're at and we're working on it. And I think that was a really good reminder as well. We've got a few things to cover. So let me just ask you about the next part of the book that I found. Again, there were so many points when I kept, and this is the first time people who've been on these calls before will know that I usually have my books with sticky notes on them. And this is the first time that I actually challenged myself to read online, and that was something different for me because I like the hard copy book. But when I got to this part in the second half of your book where you focus on community and relationships, and you say the common thread here is other people. Your relationships matter with family, colleagues, friends, your tribe. And this quote in particular, and I'm going to read it because I want to make sure I get it correct. And remember, for people who've worked with me, I love thinking about and talking about and reviewing emotional intelligence and all about our relationships. In this quote, changing your community changes the people around you, and therefore your experience of the world around you. Changing your community changes who you are in the world. Tell us more about what you found in the research, particularly about being shaped by those that we spend most time with.
Yeah, like my goal was to figure out the levers that we can pull on, right, with the most leverage. And when you think about it, the lever either has a little bit of leverage or a lot of leverage or a different amount. So most of the things, self-compassion, you pull on the lever, you become more self-compassionate. The interesting thing was, it was almost like community had a 2x factor, because when you change the people around you, it changes the world around you. Right? You just have a very different experience of the world when there's different people and you're spending different amounts of time doing different things with those different people. Your world changes. And at the same time, who you are in that world also changes. It's famously said by Jim Rohn, a management consultant, that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Right. And we can put away the calculators. We don't need to be figuring out like who's position 5, who's position 6. What does it mean to be the average of, one adult and two kids right now? It means I'm very immature.
You're funny and creative and play. That's what it means.
I can hear them arguing in the background, which is partly why I have these on tonight. Yeah, so there's an element of, we humans have a deep and fundamental need to belong with other people.
Yeah.
And so we will often conform a bit over time to either fit in or to belong. And what that does is it changes certain things about us, often superficial things, right? Like if you think back to high school, you could put on black makeup and wear black clothes and be part of the goths. You could carry a skateboard around and be part of the skateboarders. A bunch of different things. It doesn't need to be deep for it to matter in the context of the social situation. But there are deeper changes too. And if you are trying to move in a certain direction and that is not supported by the community around you, it is going to be very difficult. And if instead you surround yourself with people who already act the way you want to be acting, it's going to make your changes so much easier. So that's why it has this twofold effect on us. It changes our world and changes who we are in the world. It's super important. And there, like there's that Harvard study, the longest running one on, I think, health. Anyway, but they concluded recently that the people in your life were, I think, was the biggest predictor of your longevity and happiness. Something like when they check people at 50 and then again at 80, the people at 50 who were healthiest at 80 weren't the healthiest at 50. They were the ones with the strongest relationships.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I among the different elements when I read this, about 10 years ago, might be longer, I joined a running room. I would never ever consider myself a runner. It just wasn't part of who I was. I was that kid in what's it called, middle school, that would be the last to pull up after a long track meet or whatever. And I thought, no, I actually want to start running. It was something that I wanted to try. And it was through that group where I actually started calling myself a runner. I'm now a quasi runner because I don't do it as often as I'd like, but it actually became something that, and you get immersed in the ethos and in the culture and in the community. It really does. Then I took on the identity of a runner at that point, and since that time. And I loved your example, if I can share it for those who might not have gotten to it in the book. And correct me if I'm misinforming. I don't want to do that. You had a particular belief system on money and how you spend it. And it seemed to be at odds with people that you were spending a lot of time with, which caused some, we in coaching, we oftentimes say, are you in alignment or out of alignment? And you seem to be misaligned with that aspect until you found people who shared the same thinking and philosophy and learned from them moving forward that saving for the long term is actually a positive thing, not necessarily a bad thing. Is that something that was sort of part of what you used that example in the book, I think, and I'm just curious your takeaways from that.
I think one of the things I find most interesting about it is that I was already willing to stick out. Right? Like there's a bit of a spectrum. How much do you want to be like everyone else in the crowd? How willing are you to stick out? I was already willing to stick out. I was saying no to people who were inviting me to going out for ridiculous evenings just because I was like, I don't want to drop $500 on an evening. I was saying no to other things because I was just making choices that were more aligned. I was like, I wasn't that happy in my position, so I wasn't going to spend all this money because in my view, I was sacrificing my life energy to earn that money. So that money must be really valuable. And if I were to throw it away, then it would waste my sacrifice. So that was actually, I don't know that I would have been nearly so thrifty if I was doing something that was more aligned and energizing. I think I would have been happy to spend money. But what it did allow me to do, and then I discovered this world and I just sort of, my perspective changed. I just saw the world differently. I saw people who got to retire at 30 and work became optional in their life. I was like, oh my God, they work for 10 years and then they're retired for 70. Like, that's pretty cool. And especially like knowing that I wanted to write, I want to do other things. I'd love to, I don't know, open a woodworking shop. I'd love to start a retreat center in the north somewhere and do like running retreats and all sorts of stuff. And I've always wanted to do fun things. And the idea that work could be optional was cool. So anyway, it made me think like, oh, I belong with these people.
Yeah.
So I didn't even know that many in real life. I don't even be sure I had met any in real life, but just even knowing that they existed helped me feel like I belonged.
Yeah, no, I hear that. I certainly hear that every time. For anybody who, I know there might be a couple of people who've gone through coaching, every time I participated in my coach training, I felt, yes, this group gets it. This group gets what I'm trying to, what I feel, what I'm thinking, what I'm experiencing. So I totally get it. And as lawyers, it's one of the things that I hear about all the time. People trying to find that right environment, whether it is big law, small law, in-house, social justice, not practicing law. And I think that once you find it, it feels really, really like it fits. It fits really well. But as we're finding it, I want to turn to the next part briefly, because as we're trying to find it, lawyers, professionals can be quite hard on ourselves sometimes, on ourselves. One of the factors you find in your book for being happy: self-compassion and self-kindness. So on the one hand, we might be really hard on ourselves, but on the other hand, you found that the happiest lawyers are those who are self-compassion and self-kindness. How do you reconcile these two?
I guess I would say that there's actually not much to reconcile, right? Like, you started this by saying this title may seem like an oxymoron to some, and it's because of the stereotype of
Right?
lawyers not being happy. And there's no, there's a, the stereotype also has lawyers not being kind to themselves. There's nothing to that doesn't fit. That fits perfectly. Right? Certainly, I had everything else, right? Like, I was aware, I took action, I had great people around me, and I had the other elements of the happy lawyer model that we haven't gotten to yet. I had everything except for self-compassion. I was pretty miserable. So when you're not kind to yourself, you're just constantly dragging yourself down. When you don't have perspective, you're heaping expectations on yourself in a way that drags you down. And this has always been my kryptonite. It's still something that I struggle with. I'm a lot better at it now than I used to be, thank heavens. But it's it's something that I work on for sure.
It's interesting you call it your kryptonite, and I'm just wondering, self-compassion, self-kindness, are there, this as well as unique to each of us, but are there ways or activities, or how do you encourage clients, friends, yourself to be more self-compassionate and more self-kind?
I mean, the way I look at self-compassion, it's got two components. Okay. One is self-kindness and the other one is perspective. And I do find that the two are separate. One is actually like, how are you treating yourself? The kindness is the how, but the perspective deals a little more in the what. What are the expectations you're setting for yourself? What's the story you're telling yourself about whatever's going on? Like, I've made a mistake in my practice before and my stomach usually falls out. I think it's the end of the world. What that is a lack of perspective while I get sucked into the narrative of the moment. But we build the self-compassion muscle. And so in subsequent times when the floor falls out from underneath me, I recognize that like, this has happened before. It will happen again, not just to me, but to lots of other people. So it's okay. In terms of answering the other part of your question, though, like how do I encourage people to get better at it? There's a bunch of different ways. The first way, unsurprisingly, starts with self-awareness, right? You got to see what it is you're doing. You got to figure out what it is you want to be doing. And then you got to start taking action to try and change it for yourself. One of the resources that I love that I often recommend is, I think it's called the Self-Compassion Workbook by Kristen Neff and someone else. And so I made it halfway through that workbook and noticed a pretty big difference. It's pretty nice. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, what's interesting, like she's one of the foremost researchers on self-compassion. So it's interesting to look at her stuff and see that she has self-compassion with 3 components. One of them is like kindness, I think, like how you're treating yourself. The other one is common humanity, which I see as very similar to perspective, right? Seeing yourself as, just another, as a member of the human race with all that entails. And her third aspect is awareness. You got to actually see what's going on in order to be self-compassionate. And that's already part of the model elsewhere. So it was interesting. I found it just like a peek behind the curtain. I did my best to try and come up with all of this stuff based on my research, based on my journey, based on my client's journey. And afterwards, I was looking through Kristen Neff's stuff.
Interesting.
I felt very relieved to see, okay, if Kristen's
right
found the same thing as me, yeah, then, I'm doing good.
I've just added her website, selfcompassion.org, into the chat. So and it's literally self-compassion.org. So if anybody's interested in reading a little bit more about what we're discussing here, please go right ahead. We've got a couple more questions, and then I'm going to open it up to others who may have comments or questions for you, Paul. Near the end of the book, you write about one's commitment to excellence playing a factor. You speak of being an artisan, and I love that phrase. It took me back to one of our books from the summer, with regards to the perfumist of Paris, and talking about being an artisan and of the journey of excellence. Now, I mentioned to you that it reminded me of a particular poem, and I'll link it to people who might be interested. Cavafy's poem of Ithaca. But can you speak to us about the journey of excellence? What was that? What was the relevance of that? What was important for you about that?
I think that it was actually driven by very practical reasons rather than the poem Ithaca, which we'll get back to. By the way, thank you for introducing me to it. Is driven for very practical reasons. There is always going to be someone better than us at something, right? So the minute that we think we've arrived, it's more like, how do you determine when you've arrived? How do you determine when you're good enough, when you have enough excellence to then be able to rest on your laurels, right? And given that there's always someone better than us, I don't know that that line is easy to draw. The other reason I talked about the pursuit of excellence rather than being excellent is because the minute that you feel that you've arrived, that's the minute when you start to slip, if that makes sense. Like people who think they're excellent enough and have stopped pursuing it, then it's just it's a moment in time when they are excellent enough, and that denouement happens, whether it's short or fast, or long, sorry, it happens. So it was very much about saying, look, it's the pursuit of excellence. If you're constantly learning and getting better, there's always room to grow. There's always ways to grow in your excellence, and it matters. It's satisfying, and also it gives you more leverage for the other stuff that matters in your life. It's really important. What's really interesting, I found that poem Ithaca really neat. I had never read it before.
I'm just sharing a link to it for people.
I want to read even just a tiny bit of it. As you set out for Ithaca, hope your road is a long one, full of adventure, full of discovery. This poem really speaks to me about the journey over the destination.
Mhm.
And I can see why you came up for you when I'm talking about the pursuit of excellence rather than achieving excellence. But to me, honestly, I read this poem and I think of self-compassion, like
Interesting.
understanding that it's not about the destination. You don't need to judge yourself as a failure until you hit Ithaca.
Mhm.
Remember that the point of it is the journey.
Yeah.
That the point is to arrive at Ithaca and realize you never needed to be there in the first place. That is just there in order to get you out and on the road. Like, it's beautiful. I'm almost getting shivers here.
I know, I agree, and I hope people enjoy the poem. I've sent a link to it, but you talk about the journey of excellence, and of course, with that journey, Paul, we know that um, learning the journey towards excellence can be uncomfortable, right? You know that you're growing and learning when you're feeling a little bit of discomfort or a lot of discomfort, and sometimes people want to resist that. But that's actually part of that journey of it towards excellence as well. I don't know how you've experienced it, but whenever you're learning and growing, it takes, whether it was math back in high school, whether it's running, whether it's coaching, whether it's lawyering, whether it's particular skills in lawyering, as you're learning it, you're feeling that muscle build and that skill developing, and it can be really darn uncomfortable as you're going through it. But pursuing it and having that as your goal, as you mentioned, I think is really a wonderful place to, wonderful perspective, not a place to be, but a wonderful perspective to have on it.
Mm-hmm. I hear you talk about there, like normalizing the discomfort that comes from pushing out of your comfort zone, right? And that is, I mean, I have that has happened so much for me on my own journey as a coach,
Mhm.
as a speaker, as a writer. It just so much. Like when I started with blog posts, I used to agonize over each post. When I started with my podcast, I used to agonize over each podcast. It is a muscle that grows with time. And I've come to remind myself that actually, Paul, you signed up for it. Like this is not, it's not a negative emotion.
Yeah.
It's just an uncomfortable emotion. And this is the flip side of the coin of living. You were feeling like you weren't living. Now you're feeling alive. And that comes with this.
Yeah.
This is part of it.
No, I agree, and it's interesting because when people are in their work world in particular, and I've seen it with clients, I've seen it with students before that, I've experienced it where they get complacent. Um, they can do things with their eyes closed. They can do things without thinking potentially. And I've heard people say, and I'm bored. I need to be able to do something. Sometimes it's okay for a little bit, but then there's this um, motivation to move forward, I think, as we need to be learning. I'm a lifelong learner, so I think with all the research that I've done, all the people that I've spoken with, all the books that I've read, learning keeps us growing. So I think that commitment to excellence is a really important part that you have written about based on your research and based on the conversations that you've had with the various lawyers that you've talked to. So I'm curious to see what others might think about that as we open it up. But I want us to go. I've put a note in the chat that we'll be opening up questions and comments soon. One more question specifically based on the book and on the chapter. And
Can I just jump in really
please go
quick
right
about
ahead.
the excellence? There are people who talk about excellence and the importance of excellence. Right? Like Cal Newport and the book So Good They Can't Ignore You comes to mind. There are others too. But I don't see that many people talk about it in the context of happiness. In fact, I'm not sure if people do, right? And that was excellence to me was the most surprising thing in the model. I probably could have told you, a guest at the beginning, even though I didn't like it, that self-compassion belonged in here.
Mhm.
But excellence, and that's why I call it the happy lawyer model rather than the universal model, because in theory, it must be possible for someone to be happy without the pursuit of excellence. But I just don't think it's possible for me. It's not possible for other people like me, like a lot, like the people I interviewed, where their work matters to them and they do take it seriously. They have a vocation, whether it is their work or whether it's adjacent.
Mhm.
it, it matters. And so that's the interesting thing. It also, I mentioned this very briefly, but I think its impact on your life cannot be understated. the better you are, the more leverage you have to get the other things you want.
Say more
Whether
about that.
whether it's money, like if you are a better technical lawyer, or if you are better working with people, or if I'm a better coach, the better we are, the more leverage we have for the other things. Now, that could mean that you get a promotion. It could mean that your work pays you more to keep you, or you get a new job, you change workplaces. It could be that people give you schedule flexibility because they just don't want to lose you. They don't want to give you any of these concessions, but they would much rather give you those concessions and keep you than lose you. And that comes because you are so good at what it is you do. It could be the black letter rules of the law. It could be being a super detailed contract negotiator and drafter. It could be just being really good at working with people, so that you've got the soft skills that make things run smoothly and people just want to work in a department where you are there. So excellence is super important. It almost has the twofold effect, like community there, because
Yeah.
it's satisfying in and of itself, and also it helps with this other stuff.
And it's interesting to hear that you were surprised by that finding. Of all of the findings, that one was surprising to you. But lots to unpack there. I want to take us to your appendix, and I'm grateful to you for having all sorts of available resources. What I didn't mention earlier, you allow for self-reflection in your book, throughout your book, by those what did you call them, interludes? I think there's little places where you can reflect on. And then in the appendix section, you talk about, and we had this conversation previously, I'm curious what our guests are going to think about this. You talk about how some people think of the skills of visioning and manifesting as, I use the word mumbo jumbo, or maybe I have got that in quotes, so I think that you may have
I
used
use
that.
that word too, I
You
think.
use that phrase. How have you come to respond to this when people might say, I'm not going to do a visioning exercise, or what do you mean by manifesting? That's not for real lawyers. That's not for real professionals. How have you come to respond to this whole notion? Because you put it as a resource, and it's a really important, I think it's a really important tool. But let's hear you speak about that a little bit.
Okay, so let's tease it apart for a second. Let's deal with manifesting and visioning separately. Let's start with visioning. So is visioning mumbo jumbo? Well, it's like saying, are lawyers good? Some lawyers are good, some are not, right? So it really depends on the visions. It depends on the manifesting, right? So it's not true as a blanket statement, but there is very much truth in there to be found by people who want to look for it. So what is the big advantage of visioning? I think that it's fairly well accepted in the industry right now, starting from Stephen Covey and his 7 habits of highly effective people, talking about starting with the end in mind, right? Having your vision for what you want, all the way through to 50 Cent, the rapper, who wrote a book with Robert Greene, and they talk about, I wrote down this quote because you tipped me off. You're going to ask this question. They say in that book, we are generally dealing with so many immediate battles, it is hard for us to lift our gaze above the moment. It is a law of power, however, that the further and deeper we contemplate the future, the greater our capacity to shape it to our desires.
Mm. Yeah.
So if anyone was to tell me I don't do visioning, I would say, okay, what do you want? Right? Visioning is just my word for it. If they don't like the word, we don't need to use it. So that's my thought on visioning, that it's it's like driving somewhere. If you're gonna, if you don't know where you're going, it doesn't really matter what direction you head in. Right.
You don't need to have a vision board to vision, right? I think
Yeah.
people associate visioning sometimes with vision boards, and some people love the vision boards, and other people think, I don't want to have to do that. But in their minds, they see where they want to go, usually.
Mm-hmm. Now,
Manifest. Oh.
manifesting is something I have a particular interest around, and it is a rabbit hole. I have an answer, but it's longer. So I don't, do we want to see if other people have questions they want to ask in the interim, and then
And then we'll come back to,
then
okay,
we can
let's
come back
just
to it?
open it up. keep manifesting on hold. I'll put it in a parking lot so we can remember to come back to it. Anybody who wants to join the conversation about The Happy Lawyer, either a comment or a question, if you've had the chance to read the book, or just about the conversation, or about your experience about being happy in the profession or in what you're doing potentially, either put up your hand or unmute. Just give it a second. Paul, as they're thinking, let's go back to manifest. Do you want to give it another second?
Okay.
Okay. Keep those thoughts though. We're going to come back to it after we've manifested. Paul.
I'm just sharing my screen on the iPad. I want to draw it. This, there we go.
There we go.
Sharing screen, notability. Okay. So the reason I'm manifesting really does have a bad rap, and I think for good reason. Yeah, seriously, for good reason, right? Like there's The Secret. They talk about what is manifesting really. Manifesting is calling your desired future into being. That's it, right? So you take your vision and you manifest it, you make it real. Now, there are some people out there that say that it is that simple. You just focus on the vision, you believe it to be true, and then boom, it gets called forth into your life by mystical forces. I'm not saying that's not true. I'm saying that the skeptical part of me won't allow me to believe that that's true. So, and yet I've been deeply curious about it. So this is I don't know this well enough yet to write a full book about it, but I think I know it.
It's your second book coming.
Yeah.
There's something there.
The Manifesting Lawyer. Okay, so this is us. Us, and then there are our behaviors, and there are our results. Okay. Now, our behaviors lead to our results, and we lead to our behaviors. These are usually, let me make this a little smaller so I can write a little more. Habitual or habit, right? So our habitual behaviors take us into our current results. Now, what does it mean for what we are? We are there are oops, sorry, I want people to be able to read this. Beliefs and our self-image, right? You mentioned earlier we were going to get into identity later.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here we are. This is your identity. Our identity determines the actions we take, right? Whether we are the type of person who does go for a run, and you can see in your story, you didn't used to be, and now you are that type of person, right? So how we see ourselves determines the type of behaviors we take, which determine what our results are. What's interesting is if we want, we can now put the behaviors on a spectrum. We can say, these are the behaviors we don't want. These are the behaviors we want. And we can put results on a spectrum. These are the results we want. These are the results we don't want, right? Now, the reality is it's more than a one-line spectrum, but roughly, there could be a reality we want less than the one we have, and there could be a reality we want more than the one we have, even if there's a bunch that look different, right? So if we want new results, we're going to need new behaviors. Now, the tricky part about new behaviors is these behaviors are habitual. They're habits. They're very easy for us. If we need to take these new behaviors to lead to these new results, they are very effortful, right? They take a lot of effort. But what happens is As James Clear says in his book, Atomic Habits, he says, every action that we take is a vote that we cast for who we are becoming. So the more that you take your action, the more votes you are casting for who you are becoming, the more that these new behaviors are changing, your identity. The more that they turn in these new results, like you probably, as you started running, it was really hard the first time and it got easier over time. Your results changed. Those also change your identity, right? The other interesting thing is we can look at, say, our environment as another factor that really matters here. Why does it matter? Because it helps impact the behaviors that we take, right? The example that I think of for myself is if I want to eat more healthy, maybe I don't have chips in my home, right? It doesn't mean that I won't eat chips, just the same way that if I have the chips in the house doesn't mean that I will eat chips, but it certainly affects the likelihood of the behavior. So by modifying your environment, you can modify some of your behaviors. So an effective new behavior is to modify your environment to then make some of these new behaviors more effortless. The other interesting thing is that we can actually, we'll do a little.
What's that squiggly line for?
A squiggly line is a wave.
Ah.
It doesn't really look like a wave, so I'm sorry about that. On the one side, we have our conscious mind. And on the other side, we have our subconscious mind. So I did it on purpose where most of the beliefs and most of the self-image sit in the subconscious mind. Some of it certainly sits in the conscious mind, but most of it is in the subconscious, that it's been created over time and we're not really aware of it. That's really the difference between the subconscious and the conscious, right? If you're aware of it, it's in your conscious mind. And if you're not aware, it's below, it's in the subconscious. So what happens is as you're manifesting, one, you need to have a desired future that you're trying to call into being. But what does it look like to actually do it, right? Well, one, you need that future. Just having the vision matters. But then two, when you visualize living in it, what you're doing is you are slowly, emphasis on the slowly. What color do I want to use? Keep using pink. You're slowly changing your beliefs and your self-image. The more that you sit there and visualize yourself running, you visualize yourself having completed a race, the more that your subconscious beliefs and self-image change, which in turn starts to drive your behaviors over, right? The interesting thing, I think, is that, sorry, all of these things are interesting things, as you can tell by listening to me. I think normally we've got our beliefs and our self-image, and it's probably not just one straight line. It's probably a bunch of lines. We've got a bunch of different behaviors that are all sort of natural to us. Simply by coming up with the vision, we start to narrow those down, right? So simply having the vision is important in and of itself. But then the more we visualize the vision, the more it changes our beliefs and our self-image, which in turn moves our behaviors over, which in turn gives us new results. So do I think that I could manifest a spot on the Toronto Raptors lineup? No. Like,
are you sure about that now?
I'm pretty sure that my pro basketball days are long behind me. Never having had amateur basketball days. That is that is a dream that came and went before I knew it. But I don't think you can manifest whatever you want. What it does is it helps you believe yourself to be different, show up differently so that you can get different results. Now, there is some result here. This is being a Raptors player, right? There's some results which are beyond a line of possibility. But there's all of this stuff. So that means that everything here is impossible. but everything here is still possible.
You might be a really good basketball player or have fun playing basketball or play basketball more often. Maybe just not become a Raptors player at that point.
Yeah. Right. Like there's all sorts of things. And who knows? It might be possible to be a basketball coach.
There you go. There you
Right.
go.
If I dedicated myself to it for 10 years, we talked about really in
Excellent.
10
Yeah.
years and 20 years, you have no idea what you can accomplish. It could be that 30 years from now, I am actually a pro coach.
Yeah.
Like, do I want to do that? Not necessarily, but I just want to highlight that there is so much. If these are our current results, then all of this space is still possible. And most of us have no idea what exists beyond this dotted line there.
I won't. Can we take a picture of this? Do you mind if I take a picture of this? Because I think it's just but I will only take it if you want me to take the picture.
Sure, you can take a picture of this.
I am going to take a picture of that right now. Hang on there we go. So when you do your second book, give me 2 seconds. When you do your second book on the manifesting lawyer, there we go. We've got that captured right there.
What do you think? Like, what does this bring up for you? What do you think of manifesting? Where would you change this? And also opening it up to the floor if anyone else wants to weigh in, either with questions or with their own comments.
So it's interesting, and I'll ask folks to again put their hand up just so we can, or just unmute if they want. As you were drawing this, one of the things that really struck me is generating the possibilities, generating the ideas, right? And eventually, with your vision, being able to think about which path or which paths or which opportunities to actually pursue. So you came up with Raptors player, but you came up with a whole bunch of other things, some on this side of the impossibility spectrum and some on this side of the possibility spectrum. But for me, and many of our clients will start with the ability to and permission to even think about what those options might be, because especially when we are in our head stuck with I am a lawyer, period, full stop. That's the identity part, right? I am an M&A lawyer, I am a fill in the blank lawyer, I can't do anything else. That's oftentimes one of the first comments that I'll hear students, clients making. And then when you start thinking about what those possibilities are, there's this energy that comes from being able to think about, oh, there are options. My self-image is changing. Now, to be able to make that reality, what do I have to do? What are the behaviors that can help get me to the results? But giving ourselves permission to have those other identities, I think is really a really great first step for so many when they don't give themselves that permission initially. I want to go to Sharon, unless you have any comments on that. Sharon, thank you for joining us. I see your hand up. If you want to, there we go. Nice to have you. Welcome.
Thanks. You just brought it all together, Gina, with my 2 questions, the sort of or comments that came up when I was listening to this. And one is, I truly believe that no one would have the vision or the want to be a Raptors player if they truly couldn't do it. Like Paul clearly was throwing that out there, like, sure, I can't be a Raptors player, but I would doubt that that's something that's a burning desire for him right now, right? And I think that anything that's a true burning desire for anyone, I think it puts it into the realm of possibility. It might be a lot of hard work. It might be 30 years. There might be, a variation of it. But again, I think that achievement would be on a spectrum. And I think the second thing is with respect to lawyers. I mean, we follow rules for a living, right? And you were saying you're a personal injury lawyer. That's all you do. And you're told that you can't do anything else. And so now you're trapped in a paradigm that you feel you can't get out of, because if you're going to be, personal injury lawyer, then you've got to do A, B, C, D, and E. And if I don't do A, B, C, D, and E, I'm not a good personal injury lawyer. I don't like A, B, C, D, and E, and I have no choices. So then what do you do? And I think the biggest thing is that anticipatory fear that you feel that if you make a change, that you really can't do anything but what you've been told that you should want to do and that you should do. And my question for Paul would be, how do you help, your clients break away from that paradigm whereby they feel they have no choices. I always find it sad when people leave the profession, for example, if it's not really what they want. They might just be in the wrong area of law, or they might just be in the wrong environment, or in the wrong firm, or, if you value the autonomy and freedom, then, maybe you work for yourself, but the fear holds people back. So how do we remove that fear and help people get to where they want to be so that they can truly vision what they truly want, and work toward that goal?
Mm-hmm. It first of all, Sharon, thank you for the question. It's a really good one. It will probably come as no surprise for those of you who've made it through the whole book that I would say that we would start with self-awareness. What is it they think they want? What is it they feel trapped in? Why is it that they feel that they can't make any changes? Like, what's behind it, right? There's different layers to that. What are the stories that they're telling themselves about what is possible, about what it is they should be doing? Is it because like good fathers and good mothers show up to work and like earn a good paycheck? Is it because they need a certain amount of prestige in their life in order to help support their self-esteem, right? There could be all sorts of reasons that are keeping them trapped, because I mean, none of us are in an actual jail. None of us are actually trapped. And yet a lot of us feel trapped. And so it's things of our own imposition, often that we've inherited, whether from parents or from society at large. But unearthing those. Once you're clear on the various factors at play, the next steps usually start to present themselves, to be honest. Like if someone is feeling trapped, a whole bunch of things they don't like, sometimes they really don't like A, B, C, D, and E, in which case you need to figure out how to minimize their impact in your life. Sometimes they actually don't mind them. They're just really missing F. And so for that person, the solution isn't necessarily less of A through E. The solution is more F. Once they start getting F in their life, they don't care as much about the fact that they're doing A, B, C, D, and E. So that's why I think that self-awareness is always the starting point. And then you start to place little bets. Oh, I think that maybe if I did a little more of this, maybe if I did a little more something creative, maybe if I spent a little more time with my family without phones, I think that the needle would be moved. Maybe not a lot, maybe 5%, but that's a start. And we'll test it. Maybe one of those things will work and the other one won't. Maybe the big thing is the boundary piece with work, to be able to carve out an extra 2 hours a week to do something like this, right? But there's so many different levers. Does that answer? Do you have any follow-up questions from there?
I think that makes a lot of sense. The self-awareness, I guess, would give you perhaps the confidence. It's acting on what you figure out from the self-awareness. And I think that's often the block. I mean, looking at who you are, what you enjoy, what you don't enjoy, how you minimize things that you don't like is a first step. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing. And I think people often feel that it is all or nothing. So I was happy, to hear you say that, because you can change a couple of things. Like you said, maybe you're not in a space or a place where you really don't like it. You're just missing one element. And I think that does come from examining your own sort of authenticity and where you are. And I think, a lot of people, when lawyers leave, it's been my sort of observation, perhaps, when lawyers leave the practice, they still do things that are very similar. For example, yourself and Gina, like, you still want to help people, right? You still want to solve problems. There's a lot of like overlap in who we are and why we do what we do and how we got here. And I think examining those things, what do you like about, your interactions every day with people, and how you interact with your clients, no matter what profession it might be. Thank you. It's very helpful.
I appreciate it. And I've got to say, Sharon, I wrote down anticipatory fear of change. And I think that is something that I see all too often. I sometimes experience it. And Paul, I wonder if in your conversations, in your interviews, if that came up, that people sometimes fear change, and those that perhaps are, and I don't want to make a hypothesis here, but those that might be happier in what they do tend to have a different relationship with change and fear it a little bit less, or perhaps despite the fear or with the fear. Thank you, fear, for guiding me, but I'm going to do it anyhow, move forward. So I wonder if you have any comments on that part of Sharon's comment, and then we'll go to Ivana.
Yeah, I think I was going to land where you did there, which is fear happens. And so I think it's about moving despite the fear. And Sharon was talking about taking the steps and building the confidence. And I think that's totally right? The confidence comes from the self-awareness and from taking the action together, because then you start to feel more self-determined. You start to feel less trapped, because you see that, oh, I can make changes, and those changes have a difference. And like, I haven't done it all yet, but I can see that if I just continue to show up, I can do it. And I believe I can continue to show up.
No, I think that's really good. Ivana, welcome. I see the hand. We see the hand. There we go.
Okay, technology, sorry.
And we hear the voice too now. Hello.
Hello, hi. Paul, thank you very much. I found your book very enlightening and very positive. And I think it's the way you approach things. And what resonated with me the most was this concept of the pursuit of excellence. I think I am in this group, and I think there are many people who feel like excellence is something that needs to be described, that has some parameters. And you look at it as a process. And I feel like there is less pressure then, if you look at it from that angle, because I think it's more reachable then, or at least, there's a hope, along the way, you'll reach that level where you'll feel satisfied that, what you're doing is some sort of excellence. My question is, if you have clients who feel like they need to determine what excellence means and when they actually have reached that level, how do you do it? How do you coach these people?
First, thank you for the kind comments on my book. I appreciate it. It's not, as Gina said earlier, it's not like out in the wild yet. I mean, it is, but it's sort of hidden out in the wild. So this is still some of my earliest sort of interactions with other people about it. So I appreciate that. A brief comment on excellence that may go part of the way towards answering your question, and then I'll finish answering it to the best of that I can. If I've seen so far, it's only because I've stood on the shoulders of giants, right? I think Isaac Newton said that. And I feel like it's applicable to me too. I'm well acquainted with Seth Godin and some of his work that talks about putting yourself out there, leaning into the discomfort of it, trying to get better, trying to do work that really matters. And so that is how I see excellence, as a pursuit, as a craft, as a continual sort of process. And so when people say to me, what sort of excellence matters here, I say, oh, that's a really good question. What sort of excellence does matter here? Right? Because they're the expert in their lives. You're the one that shows up at work and sees what's going on. Broadly, I'll separate it into two categories, right? There's the excellence that's objective, that we can all agree on. And this is something like, you need to know what the law says. If you are drafting an agreement, you need to know what the clause does, how indemnities work, etc. There are some things that we all need to know. And this is someone else's game when you think about it, right? Like, this is someone else has created these rules. This is how it is. The other hand is your game. When you try and play someone else's game exclusively, it's a lot harder for you, because it's not your game. It's someone else's game. You're trying to dance to their rules. You're just trying to be better than them. But there's a real truth in the world that takes a little while to really internalize. And that is that different is better than better. So
Say that again, Paul. Different is
different,
better than better.
different is better than better. Yeah, I
Better
got it
than better.
from Sally Hogshead. I can't remember if she's got a book on it. I've seen her speak a few times, and it's just, it blows my mind every time. In this hand, there is a level of excellence that is you, that
Mhm.
you bring to it. We all have different strengths, weaknesses, gifts, right? I remember a while back asking a boss, I was like, so can I get a promotion? And she's like, well, I really think you need to work on your technical skills. Like, you're not as good as so-and-so. And I was thinking about it. I'm like, I mean, she's right. So-and-so is one of the best technical lawyers that I've ever met. And at the same time, then I asked myself, well, what do I bring that that guy doesn't? I'm like, actually, it's the people skills, right? It's harder to sell a little bit, like to then say to the boss, actually, what I really do really well is to work with people. But like, you put me at a negotiating table and things just go smoother, right? We don't, there's way fewer, pardon the language, way fewer pissing contests. We can just focus on the shared goals, all sorts of things. And so there's, that's me trying to play my game. Yes, I still need to know what clauses do, how indemnities work, all sorts of other stuff, but it's about sort of balancing it as you pursue excellence, and like leaning into one, then leaning into the other. And then as you lean into this one, you'll find that your capabilities in this have changed. You lean back in here, and then you find that this has changed. And as you dance back and forth, you'll find that it's iterations, that you're not actually leaning back and forth. You're going in a spiral up, that you're constantly being on this side and this side, but each time it's leveling up.
Great, thank you.
Ivana and Paul, Paul, I don't know if because you mentioned raptors, my mind as you were talking about excellence and the two hands, my son would absolutely laugh at me right now. So I apologize. I'm going to be completely vulnerable here. When the what is it, the NBA All-Star games, what came to my mind is there is am I going to use the right phrase? The jump shot, and then there's the jump shot competition. So everybody knows the rules to a jump shot, but then in the competition, people play their game. People try and excel themselves, first of all. Yes, it's a competition, but they all try and one-up themselves, I think, as I've seen it. Am I correct on this analogy, or is this totally way off,
Yeah,
Paul?
I think you're thinking of the dunk competition.
That's
right?
it. The dunk.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was sorry, not the dunk competition. Thank you.
I
But
didn't know yours, Nina.
but I'll take it a step further, right? Like, I'm not a super basketball expert either, but I know that the game has changed,
Yeah.
right? That it used to be that it was played a lot closer to the boards, closer into the paint, and then the 3-point shot changed things. And then all of a sudden, Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, the Golden State Warriors, they called them the Splash Brothers. It changed the game. Before that, it was what, the Suns and that Canadian guy who were very fast, and it changed the pace of the game dramatically. So there are these different people who show up who say, I've got a strength that is not how it's currently being played. And this whole state of the game changes to catch up with it. It used to be that the big men were just expected to be big and stand under the net. Now they're expected to have a 3-point shot to space out the floor. And so those old big men are not as playable anymore, because it's constantly someone new is coming up and saying like, oh, wait till they get a load of my special sauce. And that adds on to here, and it changes this for everybody. And we all have the opportunity to do this in our own realms.
No, so very true. And Ivana, I really thank you for that question, because in terms of just really being able to draw it together, that excellence as a process versus a thing. And I think that perspective really is helpful. I always promise to get people off as soon as we can at 8:30, and I just realized it was 8:30. So I wanted to just remind you, and if you don't have it, I will give you in 2 seconds Paul's information, paul@karvanis.com, and you can read more about his work at leaderrising.com or happylawyerproject.com. Be sure to leave a review if you are reading his book and when you read his book. A reminder to lawyers on the call that this is an hour and a half of professionalism, and I'm inviting you to our next book club in November, on the 28th of November, with Judy Sims, where we talk about the unstuck leader, getting unstuck and staying being unstuck. But in the meantime, what I wanted to do is just read, if you haven't gotten to the ending of Paul's book, he has this poem that is really a gift, I think, that you're offering to us. And you talk about no need to suffer. Sorry.
Are you going to read all of it or just a part of it?
Just the part of it. No
Okay.
need to suffer the I'll be happy when. Just reflect, take a step, then do it all again. On second thought, y'all better write this down in pen. Reflect, take a step, then do it all again. Reflect, take a step, then do it all again. Paul, thank you for sharing that gift of your poem with us. To everybody, thank you for joining us. And it was such a pleasure. And I'm wishing you so much success with this book and with all that you're doing. So thank you for joining us, Paul.
Thank you. My pleasure. One last request of people. I've put a review link for Amazon in the comments. If you have an Amazon account, I would love a review on the book. You don't need to buy the book in order to leave a review. And it will make the launch go a lot smoother. So I would really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. All the best. So have a good night, everybody. Talk to you soon. Bye now.